The Taliban terror cabinet is our top focus story. Taliban announced their interim government in Afghanistan. Pakistan's ISI's pick, Mullah Mohammad Hasan Akhund, will be the Prime Minister of Afghanistan. Incidentally, Akhund is a UN-designated global terrorist. The cabinet actually comprises 5 ministers who've been designated by the United Nations. No woman in this cabinet. Pakistan's ISI's imprint all over it.
Most wanted terrorists, leaders with $10 million bounty on their heads, former Guantanamo Bay prisoners, mercenaries responsible for notorious attacks. No, we are not talking about a terror organization, but the men who will now run Afghanistan. The Taliban have announced an interim government declaring the country an Islamic emirate. The cabinet, which is without a single female member, has Pakistan ISI's imprint written all over it. The government will be led by Mullah Hasan Akhund. He's one of the founders of Taliban and heads Rehbari Shura, Taliban's powerful decision-making body. Akhund also features prominently on the United Nations Blacklist. Abdul Ghani Baradar will serve as his deputy. He was released from a Pakistani prison in 2018 after pressure from US. Maulavi Hanafi is the second deputy prime minister. Other appointments include Mullah Yaqub, the son of Muhammad Omar, founder of Taliban, who will act as defense minister. Next in the cabinet is Sirajuddin Haqqani, the head of Haqqani network. He is the interior minister and has close ties with Al-Qaeda. The US has a $10 million bounty on the newly minted minister. And he's not alone. Khalil Al-Rahman Haqqani, who is now the Minister for Refugees, also has a $5 million bounty on his head. Another notable mention is the new Education Minister, Abdul Baqi Haqqan. And here is what he thinks of degrees.
No PhD degree, master's degree is valuable today. You see that the people who are in power have no PhD. But all these leaders are the greatest of all.
Then came the bizarre diktat from Taliban Cultural Commission head, who banned women from participating in sports, claiming that it would expose their bodies to the media. The Resistance Front, which are still fighting the Taliban from Panjshir, have called the cabinet illegal. A key aide of slain legendary resistance commander Ahmad Shah Massoud spoke to India today on how a majority of Afghans actually don't support the Taliban.
Their heads are high, higher than before, and they indeed inspired other terrorist organizations in the world to wake up. We have now Afghanistan in our hand, which is not true. They have the land, not the people.
The Taliban are trying an image makeover, promising rights to women and minorities, among other things. But if this cabinet is anything to go by, they are clearly not walking the talk. Is this a simple case of old wine in new bottle? Bureau Report, India Today.
There are many important questions at this point of time. Why was Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar relegated? Remember, there was old talk that he would be the head of the Taliban government, but he's been made a deputy prime minister. That's point one. Point two, remember, everyone said Sher Abbas Stanikzai, he's likely to be the foreign minister. He too has been relegated. Is there then a case that different faces were put up initially, and then there is a Pakistan ISI fingerprint or footprint all over this cabinet? ISI wanted to ensure that their men are well entrenched. Mullah Hasan Akhund, the new face of the Taliban-led government in Afghanistan, a man named in the UN terror list. Akhund is not only ISI's top choice to lead Afghanistan, he's also been the head of Taliban's Rahbari Shura. Despite no military or financial muscle, Akhund, a close aide of Haqqani network, got the premier's position in Taliban cabinet, relegating Abdul Ghani Baradar to Deputy Prime Minister's post. Pakistan ISI was reportedly suspicious of his independent negotiations with the United States and Afghanistan. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the head of ISI-backed terrorist organization, the Haqqani network, is the new Interior Minister of Afghanistan, named in the United Nations terror list and with a US bounty of $10 million. DGISI Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid camped in Kabul to ensure the Haqqani network gets to call the shots in Afghanistan. Another Haqqani network leader, Khalil Haqqani, an uncle of Sirajuddin Haqqani, is the new minister for refugees in Afghanistan. He too has a $5 million bounty on his head. Haqqani network loyalist and a suicide bomb expert, Mullah Tajmir Jawad, is the new Deputy Intelligence Chief of Afghanistan. The key position in Taliban cabinet taken by Haqqani network leaders and ISI proxies. With the Haqqani network in control of eastern Afghanistan from the AFPAC border to Kabul, Pakistan's ISI remains in a dominating position.
ISI and the Pakistan strategically have always seen Afghanistan for their strategic space and strategic depth. No wonder that they have gone and interfered in Afghanistan in such a big way. Actually, they are looking at divide and rule amongst the terrorist group.
It's not just Pakistan's ISI, but even its Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi, who's holding a meeting with foreign ministers of countries in the region, including China, Iran, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, to seek support for a Taliban government. But Pakistan's meddling in Afghanistan's internal affairs is being opposed by the people of Afghanistan. Women in Afghanistan have taken to the streets to protest even the presence of the ISI chief in Kabul.
इस सिचुएशन में फैज अमीद का आने का मतलब क्या है?
मतलब क्या है?
फोकस देने के लिए,
क्योंकि
ये तालिबान को बोलते हैं ये करे वो करे, हमारा लेडीज जेंट्स मर रही है, बकरे की तरह ज़बह हो रही है.
With Lieutenant General Faiz Hamid in Kabul and Shah Mahmood Qureshi holding meetings with foreign ministers in the region, Pakistan is trying to send across the message to the world that the road to Kabul goes through Islamabad. Bureau Report, India Today. And after forming a government in Kabul, Taliban, at least for now, have claimed that they will not interfere in Jammu and Kashmir. Speaking to a Pakistani television news channel, Taliban spokesperson Suhail Shaheen said Kashmir is a bilateral issue between India and Pakistan and the matter should be resolved bilaterally through dialogue. But with Pakistan Taliban's visible tango, can Taliban be trusted?
कश्मीर एक इशू है पाकिस्तान और इंडिया के दरमियान. हम चाहते हैं कि इस मसला दोनों ममालिक के बीच में सुलहामेज़ तरीके से और बातचीत के ज़रिए सुलहामेज़ तरीके से वो हल करे दोनों. ये हमारी मौक़िफ़ है.
Joining me on India First is Ambassador Rakesh Sood, former Indian ambassador to Afghanistan. Ambassador Sood, Mullah Akhund and not Mullah Abdul Ghani Baradar as the Prime Minister. What do you make of Taliban's choice of Prime Minister? The man who's alleged to have deployed tanks, anti-aircraft guns and artillery to destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas and not the negotiator with the United States of America. What's the signal, Ambassador?
Gaurav, I think you used the wrong phrase there. You said it was a Taliban choice. I would correct it slightly by saying what we are seeing is the ISI choice. What we are seeing is ISI fingerprints on the entire composition of the names that have been announced for the interim government.
Go on, sir. There's a slight echo, and we are trying to rectify that. But give us details, sir. Why do you see this as ISI's fingerprint or ISI's handiwork?
Well, first and foremost, as you pointed out, there were all these reports that Mullah brother was likely to be the head of government. But what we are seeing is that he has been made a deputy. Second, I think it is quite clear that we see a large number of representation from the Quetta Shura. These are all people who were there in the past as well. Third, the extremely important positions that the Haqqani network, which has a very close relationship with the ISI, is indicator. Not only do we have Sirajuddin Haqqani as the interior minister, but we also have at least 3 other Haqqanis in the cabinet or in positions of authority, including dealing with the intelligence services. Finally, we also have a provision that came out that the Haqqani network will be appointing governors for 7 of the eastern Afghanistan provinces, which means that they will have a very strong share in terms of how they control the border and how they control Kabul.
So Paktia, Paktika, Nangarhar, Kunar, this entire belt will be controlled by the Haqqanis. Does this then mean that this is Pakistan ISI's stronghold? You know, when you're talking about the intelligence services, is that Tajmir Javed who's being made the deputy chief of intelligence? Would this be detrimental to those Afghans who had fought against the Taliban in 20 years of democracy? Are their lives at stake?
Well, that is something which we still have to wait and see as to how, because the Afghans eventually become nationalists. You see, the problem with Pakistan's ISI is that they have always sought to develop Pashtun Islamists. They are always more comfortable with Islamist Pashtuns rather than Pashtun nationalists. And that is why we also notice that particular tension. That particular tension always comes out when they deal with Pashtun nationalists, whether in their own country or in Afghanistan. And while the Afghans were refugees, the Taliban were refugees, and they were dependent on the ISI, and therefore they were working under the banner of Islam as Islamist fighters. But once they are in their own country, then there is an element of emerging as Pashtun nationalists.
Stay with me for a moment.
That is where the tension comes in.
Okay, stay with me for a moment. There's breaking news that's coming in from Kabul, and this is Taliban cracking down on all protesters. You've seen images through the day of women taking on Taliban, women bravely being out on the streets of Afghanistan, and we'll just show you those images of women protesting on the streets. And here what you see is Sirajuddin Haqqani, a man who has a $10 million bounty on his head. He has termed all protests illegal. The Interior Ministry, that Sirajuddin Haqqani, who's seen as Pakistan's proxy, he has now issued a farman, he's issued a diktat, he's issued an order saying no one has the right to demonstrate on the streets of Afghanistan. All protesters must seek permission 24 hours in advance. And I want our viewers to see how bravely women in Afghanistan are out on the streets protesting. Does this scare Ambassador Sood? Does this, in your view, scare the Taliban, these women on the streets? And that is why this farman from Sirajuddin Haqqani.
Well, I think that, for a long time, Pakistan has been trying to sell the story that there is a Taliban 2.0, and there were a number of people in the West who were happy to buy this story because they were interested in doing a peace accord with the Taliban. And so therefore a myth got created that there is a Taliban 2.0. I think that myth has been laid to rest by just the visuals that you just showed us, the composition of the interim government, and the actions that have been taken on the ground.
Ambassador, in your view, when Taliban promised the world, or at least the world expected of Taliban, that women's rights will be respected, there would be an inclusive government. So they've got 2 Uzbeks, they've got 1 Tajik, no Shia Muslim, no women in the cabinet. Can this be called an inclusive interim government by any stretch of imagination? Will this be acceptable to the world? Women are out on the streets protesting. Will the world remain a mute spectator? Is it time for the UN, the US, other democracies to start saying that this is unacceptable?
I think so, because incidentally, I must add, Gaurav, that the person you mentioned, the Uzbek, I mean, he is a long-time Talib supporter.
Yes.
Even in the previous regime, he was a Talib office holder. The person you mentioned as a Tajik, he himself was also a minister in the previous Taliban government during the 1990s. There is report that, we have the army chief.
Yes.
Is a Tajik.
But
then this is the army chief who was the shadow governor of Badakhshan.
Yes.
And he helped, and he's being rewarded because Badakhshan was a key province, and he helped deliver that to the Taliban. Also remember that out of the 5 Taliban leaders who were in Guantanamo and who were released in 2014, there are at least 3 or 4 of them who have been accommodated in the cabinet. You have Khairkhwa,
yes,
who was also a former minister. You have Nurullah Noori, who's a former minister. Mullah Mohammad Fazil, who's a deputy minister for defense. And Wasik, who's also the intelligence chief or the director of the intelligence services. So we see a hardline presence which is gaining prominence in the new cabinet. And so in that sense, it is hardly inclusive. What we are seeing is a completely Taliban-dominated. I assume that when we talk of inclusive, we mean non-Taliban. It is not just a question of representation of ethnicities,
Okay.
representation of minorities, representation of women,
Yes.
and so on. It is also a representation of other political forces.
Yes.
So right now, what you see is only representation of one political entity, namely the Taliban, and that too the hardline Taliban.
And it remains to be seen whether action will be there in terms of the world saying this is unacceptable, or will the world remain a mute spectator? And these brave women who are fighting, how long can they continue to fight in isolation? Ambassador Sood, for joining me here on this India First special, many thanks. I now want to shift